The cold cut deeper than winter ever should, the kind of cold that settled in bones and hopes alike, as a single mother and her small child sat on a stone bench outside a hospital that smelled of antiseptic and endings. People passed them without slowing, coats buttoned tight, eyes fixed forward, until one man who had everything stopped walking and chose instead to sit down. In that single moment, the world tilted, and a life that had been bracing for another quiet loss felt the first tremor of change. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet miracles that happen when strangers choose compassion, take a moment now to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can find their way into the world. She had been awake for nearly 2 days, the mother, her body running on coffee and worry. The hospital doors had opened and closed so many times that the sound had begun to feel like a ticking clock, counting down to something she could not name. She wrapped her coat tighter around her child, whose cheeks were pink from the cold and whose small hands clutched a faded red sweater. The child's shoes were a size too small, the soles thin, and the mother had tried to keep her feet tucked beneath her own to share warmth. Snow gathered along the edges of the walkway, and the sky hung low and gray, as if it too was waiting. She had not planned to be here like this. No one ever planned for the long chain of events that led her to a bench outside a hospital with nowhere else to go. Years ago, she had imagined a simple life filled with ordinary joys, steady work, and laughter that came easily. Instead, she had learned how quickly stability could slip away when promises broke and help never arrived. The father of her child had left early, leaving behind silence and a stack of unpaid bills. She worked 2 jobs when she could, cleaned offices at night, served coffee in the morning, and still found it was never quite enough. When her daughter fell ill, something persistent and frightening, the fragile balance finally collapsed. The hospital had been her last option. She had brought her child in with a fever that would not break and a cough that sounded too heavy for such a small chest. Inside, nurses had moved quickly. Doctors had spoken in careful tones, and forms had been slid across counters, asking for insurance information she did not have. She had signed where she could, explained where she must, and waited while time stretched thin. Eventually, they had told her that tests were needed, that it would take hours, maybe longer, and that she should wait outside because the lobby was full. So she sat on the bench, watching the doors, counting breaths, telling herself stories to keep fear at bay. Her daughter looked up at her with eyes that trusted completely, eyes that believed her mother could fix anything. That trust was heavier than the cold. She brushed a strand of hair from her child's forehead and smiled, though her chest ached with the effort. Around them, cars pulled up and drove away. Families came and went. No one noticed the quiet struggle unfolding on the stone bench. The man who stopped noticed because he had learned, long ago, how fragile life could be. He had arrived at the hospital in a sleek car, his schedule packed with meetings and decisions that affected thousands. As the CEO of a major company, he was used to moving quickly, to being surrounded by people who deferred to him, to living in a world where problems were solved with resources and resolve. That morning, he had come to visit a board member recovering from surgery, intending to stay only a few minutes before returning to his office. He walked with purpose until something slowed him, an unspoken pull that made him glance to the side. He saw the child first, small and still, her gaze fixed on her mother as if anchoring herself there. He saw the mother's tired posture, the way she leaned protectively, the way her eyes flicked toward the hospital doors with quiet desperation. There was something achingly familiar in that scene, something that reached back into his own past. Years before the titles and success, he had been a boy sitting in a similar place, waiting while his own mother worked endless hours and worried about things she never spoke aloud. He remembered benches and cold and the fear of being invisible. He could have kept walking. He had every reason to. His life was full, his time scarce, and stopping would complicate a day already overfull. Instead, he slowed, then turned, and then did the unexpected. He sat down. The stone bench was colder than it looked, and the silence between them was thick at first. He did not introduce himself or offer explanations. He simply sat, close enough to be present, far enough to respect space. The mother glanced at him, surprise flickering across her face, then looked away again, unsure what to make of this interruption. Her child, curious and unburdened by adult caution, looked up at the man with wide eyes, studying his face. Time passed differently with someone beside them. The hospital doors continued their rhythm, but the bench felt less empty. The man listened to the sounds around them, the distant sirens, the muffled conversations, the scrape of boots on snow. He noticed the way the mother's shoulders tensed whenever a nurse appeared, and relaxed only slightly when the doors closed again. He noticed the child's shallow breathing, and the way her small body leaned into her mother for comfort. Eventually, the man spoke, not with questions but with presence, offering warmth in the simple act of staying. The mother found herself talking, at first haltingly, then with the relief of someone who had been holding too much inside. She spoke of work, of exhaustion, of fear, of how she had tried so hard to do everything right and still ended up here. She spoke without looking at him, as if afraid that meeting his eyes would make the vulnerability too real. He listened without judgment, without hurry, absorbing each word as if it mattered, because it did. Inside the hospital, tests were run and charts were reviewed. Outside, something quieter but just as important was happening. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a pair of gloves, offering them to the child, whose fingers were stiff with cold. The mother hesitated, pride and need warring within her, then nodded her thanks. The gloves were soft and too big, but the child smiled, wiggling her fingers, and the sight of that small joy loosened something tight in the mother's chest. When the doors finally opened and a nurse called her name, the mother's heart jumped. She gathered her child, standing on legs that felt unsteady, and turned instinctively toward the man, ready to thank him and move on. He stood as well, his presence steady, and walked with them inside. At the desk, when the familiar questions about insurance arose, he did not interrupt or announce himself. He simply stepped closer, placing a hand on the counter, and spoke quietly to the administrator, offering assistance in a way that did not diminish the mother's dignity. The process that had seemed insurmountable moments before began to ease. Papers were refiled, calls were made, and suddenly there was a plan. The child was admitted, given a warm bed and attentive care. The mother was shown a chair beside her daughter, and offered coffee that did not taste of desperation. Through it all, the man remained nearby, a calm presence in a storm that had been raging for months. Hours later, when the child slept more peacefully than she had in days, the mother finally allowed herself to rest. She looked at the man, really looked at him, and saw not wealth or status but someone who understood. He shared, in broad strokes, the story of his own childhood, of nights spent waiting and wondering, of a mother who had done everything she could with very little. He spoke of how those memories had shaped him, how success had never erased them, only sharpened his sense of responsibility. Before he left, he made arrangements that would change the course of their lives. Medical bills were covered without fanfare. Connections were made to support services and stable housing options. A job interview was scheduled with one of his company's partners, a role with steady hours and benefits. None of it was presented as charity, but as opportunity, as something earned through resilience. In the days that followed, the mother watched her daughter regain strength, laughter returning in small bursts that felt like miracles. She attended the interview with borrowed confidence, and left with an offer that felt unreal. She moved from the edge of survival into the fragile beginning of stability. The bench outside the hospital became a memory, one she carried with her not as a symbol of despair but as the place where someone had chosen to see her. The man returned to his life, his schedule no less demanding, but something within him lighter. He did not tell the story to impress or inspire. He carried it quietly, a reminder that impact was not always measured in headlines or profits, but in moments of shared humanity. Years later, the child would not remember the cold bench or the fear, but she would grow up in a home where hope had been restored. The mother would tell her one day about the stranger who sat down when he could have walked away, about how that choice had changed everything. And the lesson would take root, passing forward in ways neither of them could predict. If this story has touched your heart, if it has reminded you of the power one choice can have, Please take a moment now to like the video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe so these stories of compassion can continue to be told. Before we reach the end, leave a comment below sharing a moment when kindness from a stranger changed your life or someone else's. Because those stories matter more than we know. The world is full of benches outside hospitals, places where people wait with heavy hearts and thin coats. Not everyone who passes will stop, but sometimes one person does, and that is enough to turn waiting into beginning, cold into warmth, and despair into a future that finally feels possible.